Well, U.S. National Security Advisor Mike Waltz says he takes full responsibility for the leak about strikes on Yemen on a group chat and admits it's embarrassing. President Donald Trump and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth have downplayed the incident, but Democrats say it's risked the lives of U.S. troops. Andrew Rudolevich is professor of government at Bowdoin College and honorary professor at University College London's Centre for US Politics, and he joins me now. Andrew, good to have you with us today. Now, firstly, how sensitive do you think was the information in these series of texts on Yemen that was sent to the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic?
Well, the editor declined to publish the most sensitive information. He's worked in the national security sphere for a number of decades, really, and has a pretty good idea of what's classified and what's not. This was information about bombing targets, about timing, about the routes that planes were going to be taking, and, of course, about targets on the ground. And so this isn't part of the most massive U.S. military campaign in history. That said, these were pretty clearly operational details that should not have been on an unclassified line.
Yes. And did this have the capacity, as the Democrats put it, to put American troops in danger?
Well, potentially. They clearly didn't know that he was on the line, that he was part of the chat. Nobody bothered to check. Even when he left the group, nobody followed up to see, well, what just happened? Who was that? So, had he been inclined or had somebody else been the accidental recipient of these texts, clearly there could have been some interest in what was going on by any number of American adversaries, including the people, involved in this immediate conflict. I would add, right, that these devices that were being used were almost certainly personal devices, one of which was physically in Moscow at the time, owned by one of the envoys of President Trump to Russia. So we have no idea whether the devices themselves were secure or compromised. Anyone could have been on the chat, in fact.
So that definitely begs the question, should such discussions be had on commercial platforms like Signal? And then, what does this tell us about the Trump administration's, I suppose, use of protocols for sensitive issues like this?
Right. Well, the obvious answer to the first question is no, absolutely not. And government policy, and in some cases law, prevents the use of such devices or such protocols. There are ways in which officials can communicate with each other, even when they're scattered across the globe. Back in Washington, they should have been in a secure room where phones aren't even allowed. Any U.S. diplomatic facility abroad has the capacity to make sure that these kinds of communications are secure. So there are problems both with the use of the device and, the fact that the folks in the conversation didn't seem concerned at all that they were using Signal rather than proper government communications channels suggests that they do it a lot. By the way, these messages also disappear after a certain amount of time. That's in potential violation of U.S. records law, including the Presidential Records Act. The cherry on the top there is that Secretary of State Marco Rubio is the acting archivist of the United States, responsible for enforcing public records laws. He didn't seem to raise any questions with the fact that he was violating that law in his own participation in the chat.
And the U.S. president, in defending his national security advisor, said it's just a glitch. So do you think he can easily shrug this off in the face of, this heavy criticisms in Congress by the Democrats? And how far do you think the Democrats will take this up the chain?
Yeah, obviously, for any true accountability to be imposed by Congress, Republicans will also have to share these concerns. But I do think it's going to be hard to shrug off. This is an easily understandable scandal. It's not hugely technical. This is literally, the highest level national security officials in the Trump administration failing to obey basic national security protocols. Texting around information and emojis, on their private devices using a commercial carrier rather than, again, using the proper national security channels. So, I think the proverbial person on the street looks at this and goes, what? Really? In a way that perhaps a more sort of technocratic scandal would not have that impact. This, I think, will be difficult. They've shifted their stories a number of times already. Blame the reporter. It's not classified. Now I think they are settling on the fact that it was a mistake, but no big deal. And to the degree that it is indicative of the sort of sloppiness by the Trump national security team, it could very well be a big deal moving forward.
Yes, and that's one very interesting point that was made in the Senate grilling of the chiefs of the CIA and National Intelligence, John Ratcliffe and Tulsi Gabbard. Both referred back to the defense secretary when they were asked if the Yemen attack plans in that message thread were classified. So do you think these perhaps are the first small signs of cracks within the Trump administration?
That's an interesting question. There was some finger pointing going on. It was clearly not their fault. It was somebody else's fault. Even if nothing happened, it was somebody else's fault, right? A lot of rhetorical dancing going on there. Pete Hegseth, of course, came in, he was confirmed on a tie vote in the Senate. He doesn't have sort of wide or deep support. He's, begun to purge the Pentagon of high-ranking officials and most notably lawyers, people who could have advised him on the issues that this kind of behavior might arouse. And so, I don't know that he's immediately vulnerable. President Trump certainly doesn't like to admit weakness. He won't want to think that he made a mistake in pushing Mr. Hegseth forward for this position. But it was notable, right, that there were no career officials on that call, as far as we could tell. This was definitely an effort to sort of avoid using the expertise in the government that would help you avoid the problem in the first place.
Yes, and one thing that was made clear in one of those texts in the thread was Pete Hegseth's disdain for Europe. It's one of its key allies, even on the defense front. Do you think European leaders would necessarily be shocked by what he had to say?
Well, given the vice president's speech in Europe not too long ago and the kinds of rhetoric that have been coming out of the White House so far, I fear they won't be shocked. It certainly won't make them happy, but I don't believe they'll be surprised to know that sort of behind closed doors, as it were, the same kind of attitudes are being expressed. It was a little bit distressing, I suspect, to hear that the U.S. highest level officials are talking about effectively extorting Europe and even other nations in the Middle East for the privilege of keeping the sea lanes open. It's a very transactional foreign policy position to be taking. And so I don't, again, think they'll be surprised, but it may just harden their resolve to feel, unfortunately, from my perspective, that they'll need to come up with ways of protecting their own security that are independent of the United States.
Okay, Professor Andrew Rudalevich, always appreciate your analysis. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.